When I was younger, I was horrified by hell. Genuinely terrified. Scared that a single wrong thought or action could lead to eternal unending torment. The version of hell, though, that terrified me, and what probably terrified many of you, really isn't how the Bible describes it, at least not exactly. Fire, demons, unending torment. This version of hell is probably the one you're the most familiar with if you grew up in church, and there's a good chance it's the one you were taught. It's also how media, and specifically for this video games, have chosen to represent it. And frankly, it's hard to blame them. It does make for a pretty kick-ass environment. A huge reason for that is the influence of Inferno by Dante Alighieri, a medieval poem that gave hell architecture. His depiction of hell was explicit, structured, brutal, a place designed for perfect torment where demons and fallen angels punish sinners for eternity. That imagery stuck. It became culturally dominant, artists ran with it, and centuries later it still shapes how we imagine hell today. Unsurprisingly, it's also one of the most common versions of hell video games choose to depict, or at least some of the more attention-grabbing aspects. Obviously, when it comes to video games about demons and hell, Doom is one of the first things that would come to mind. From its early controversies surrounding excessive violence and satanic imagery in 1993 to its continued unapologetic brutality in modern releases, Doom is a foundational touchstone for how hell is depicted in games. In Doom, hell isn't treated as a religious afterlife so much as an alternate plane of existence, opened through humanity's experiments with portals on Mars. Its residents, a grotesque hierarchy of demons and abominations, draw loosely from historical interpretations of hell's denizens, but they function less as moral arbiters and more as obstacles. Hell here is not a destination for the damned, but a hostile environment to be cleared. Doom is far from the only game to use hell as a landscape, though. Games like Diablo are extremely explicit in their framing, repeatedly sending the players into the burning hells to confront demons drawn from Christian demonology, like Lilith in the latest release. Ultrakill, meanwhile, is essentially a futuristic and abstract riff of Inferno, structuring its levels around Dante's 9 circles of hell, where players slaughter the damned alongside demons and fallen robotic angels of some sort. There's also the literal video game adaptation, Dante's Inferno, where Dante himself takes on a far more physical role, fighting his way downward through hell's punishments. And of course, I don't think any list like this would be complete without mentioning the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. In the realm of Oblivion, the lakes of fire surround you at all times, torture devices are ever present in the halls of the large spires littered throughout, and of course, there are demonic creatures wandering those ruins. What all of these depictions share is a very specific understanding of hell. It is external, legible, and navigable. This is a hell with architecture, hierarchy, clear rules. It is a space that can be mapped, mastered, and ultimately conquered. This version of hell works especially well for video games because it turns damnation into terrain. Fire becomes a hazard, demons become enemies, suffering becomes spectacle. The player isn't meant to reflect on punishment, but survive and conquer it. In doing so, hell stops being a warning and becomes a challenge, something hostile but ultimately beatable. These games aren't inventing a new hell so much as inheriting a familiar one. This is the hell shaped by medieval imagination, reinforced by centuries of art and literature, and passed down as the default image of what hell looks like the one I mentioned earlier in the video. Video games adopt it not because it's theologically precise, but because it's immediately recognizable and because it behaves like a place. However, and I imagine you've been expecting this, like I said, that version of hell is not really how Scripture lines it out. In what Christians call the Old Testament, or texts that were part of the Hebrew Bible, death is often described through the concept of Sheol. Scholars debate whether everyone went to Sheol when they died, or whether it was reserved for the wicked, while others awaited something else. I should be clear here, I am not a biblical scholar. My goal isn't to teach theology, but to trace how these early ideas continue to echo through the media that we consume. What's interesting is what Sheol is not, though. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, it's never described as a place of eternal torment or fire in the way that hell is often imagined, despite some translations using the terms Sheol and hell interchangeably and heavily associating the two. Instead, Sheol is defined by absence. It's described as a place of silence and forgetfulness, separation, also translated simply to the grave on occasion.
For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise?
Other early passages suggest that Sheol isn't a system of punishment at all, but a universal destination, something that awaits everyone, regardless of moral standing, simply the next step after life.
Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going.
Because of that, Sheol is rarely depicted in video games. It's vague, sparsely described, fundamentally unplayable. There's no spectacle or apparent conflict, there's just stillness. Based on scripture alone, it's difficult to imagine Sheol as a compelling environment, let alone one built around mechanics and progression. There is one game, though, that comes to mind that does mention Sheol, being The Binding of Isaac, which uses the name Sheol for one of its lower levels. While the connection is mostly nominal, the imagery begins to align once the enemies are cleared away. The floors are black and barren, the space feels vast but purposeless, empty in a way that feels intentional. It's not fire that defines this place, it's loneliness, darkness, and separation, both from the living world and from the presence of God experienced in life. In that quiet emptiness, The Binding of Isaac comes closer to the biblical idea of Sheol than most games have ever even attempted, by letting that absence speak for itself. So if Sheol represents one of the Bible's earliest attempts to describe death, its depiction leaves some of the obvious questions unanswered. What does justice look like? And how do we get from this quiet universal end to the far more vivid hell that later tradition, including Dante, would describe? One answer comes from what Scripture attributes to Jesus Christ himself centuries later. Where Sheol is ambiguous and passive, the language now shifts to urgency. And this time, the word being used isn't Sheol, it's Gehenna.
Do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna.
This is where things start to change. Unlike Sheol, Gehenna isn't described as a shadowy destination everyone eventually reaches, it's framed as something to be feared, associated not with silence but with destruction. Historically, Gehenna refers to a place outside of Jerusalem, long associated with violence, sacrifice, and judgment. When Jesus uses the term here, he isn't mapping out an afterlife, he's invoking that imagery as a warning, something meant to provoke change now, not curiosity about what comes later.
If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands go to Gehenna, to the unquenchable fire.
As mentioned earlier, Gehenna is but another term that certain later English translations often fold into the single word hell, much like Sheol is as well. But it sounds nothing like Sheol, where Sheol was quiet. Gehenna is destructive, urgent, a warning rather than a destination. That urgency matters because Gehenna isn't presented as a place to be explored. Jesus isn't described as geography or its inhabitants. Instead, it appears as a threat, a consequence severe enough it's meant to interrupt your behavior in the present. In that sense, Gehenna isn't about curiosity, but about prevention. This distinction is important when we start looking at games that echo this idea. The games that most closely resemble Gehenna aren't the ones that let you walk through hell, they're the ones that make you feel like something irreversible is approaching. Take Pathologic 2. From the moment the game begins, the town is already dying. You're warned constantly by characters and systems, the environment itself, that time is running out. Resources disappear, the people you're trying to save still die, and the game is really abstract about what exactly is going on. There are no demons here. It's just the mounting sense that failure will be final. Like Gehenna, Pathologic 2 isn't interested in showing you what happens after collapse. It's interested in whether you act differently before it happens. The threat isn't meant to be understood, but felt. A similar tension exists in Darkwood. The forest doesn't punish you for a moral failing, but it does close in relentlessly. Nightfall is dangerous and safety is temporary. Every day spent hesitating makes survival less likely. The world doesn't need to explain itself because the warning is embedded directly into the play. You don't explore Darkwood to learn what it is, you explore it because not doing so will destroy you. This is Gehenna's logic. Destruction's not symbolic, it's imminent. Even games that soften the blow through repetition still retain this structure. In The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, the world is constantly moving towards annihilation. The moon is falling and everyone knows it. You're given time, warnings, and opportunities to intervene. But the threat never stops being real until it's handled. The reset mechanic doesn't eliminate judgment, but it intensifies it. Each cycle reminds you of what happens if nothing changes. And that's the common thread. Gehenna isn't hell as a world, but hell as a deadline. In all these games, that emphasis isn't so much on suffering as a spectacle, but on the pressure involved. You're not invited to conquer the space, you're warned to act before it's too late. Failure doesn't lead to torment, it leads to erasure and collapse. This is why Gehenna maps so awkwardly onto traditional depictions of hell, and yet so naturally onto these games. It was never meant to be explored, it was meant to intervene, to force reflection, to demand change. When Scripture finally turns to the Book of Revelation, hell in the end times takes on its most symbolic and visually overwhelming form. The destruction implied by Gehenna expands into something cosmic, and Revelation doesn't exist to continue that warning, but to finish it. Through apocalyptic imagery, it offers a dramatic, emotional vision of judgment for those who do not enter heaven. This kind of apocalyptic storytelling isn't necessarily meant to be read literally, though. Revelation's imagery is dense with symbolism. The lake of fire, also associated with hell, appears alongside seven-headed beasts, fallen stars, sea monsters, and the complete unraveling of the world as it is known. These aren't instructions so much as visions, meant to communicate scale, finality, consequence.
Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire.
That excess, however, comes at a cost. Revelation's imagery looks nothing like the quiet stillness of Sheol and functions very differently from the urgency of Gehenna. While it may feel like a culmination of earlier warnings, Scripture itself never fully reconciles these ideas into a single unified picture of hell. Instead, Revelation overwhelms where earlier texts pulled back. What is clear is that Revelation's spectacle becomes enormously influential. Its imagery feeds directly into later works like Inferno, and through them into modern depictions of hell. This is where the fanfare returns. Destruction, chaos, fire, judgment once again takes center stage, echoed in games like Doom and Diablo. Some games don't simply borrow that demonic imagery, though. Instead, they draw directly from Revelation's apocalyptic framework, chief among them being Darksiders. In Darksiders, you play as War, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, in a world where the end times began preemptively. Angels and demons waged a war while humanity was all but erased. While the game is not a one-to-one recreation of the Book of Revelation, the imagery is unmistakably apocalyptic. What Darksiders captures most faithfully is Revelation's sense of annihilation. This is not hell as punishment for individual sin, nor hell as a place to be explored. It's judgment on a global scale. Violence and spectacle dominate the experience, mirroring how Revelation itself uses overwhelming imagery to instill fear and awe. In that sense, Darksiders doesn't depict hell so much as it depicts what Revelation is ultimately concerned with, the end of the world as we know it. No longer using hell as a warning, but describing the moment when warnings have run out. Where games like Pathologic 2 arrive at Gehenna's logic without ever referencing Scripture, Darksiders simply opens Revelation and uses what's there. The Four Horsemen, the Cosmic War, the complete erasure of humanity on this earth. It lifts these images almost wholesale, because Revelation, unlike Sheol or Gehenna, was already built to be experienced visually. It doesn't require translation. And that might be the most revealing thing about Revelation's influence on games broadly. Sheol resists depiction because it's defined by absence. Gehenna resists it because, as Jesus described it, it never really seemed like a place in the first place. But Revelation practically invites adaptation. Its imagery is so fully formed, so deliberately overwhelming that artists and developers don't need to reimagine it. They just need to render it in that sense. The games that draw from Revelation aren't really reinterpreting Scripture so much as visualizing it. For centuries, interpretations of hell have been debated, reshaped and often left unresolved. Scripture itself offers multiple, oftentimes conflicting images: quiet absence, urgent warning, or apocalyptic destruction. Rather than forming a single unifying doctrine, hell remains ambiguous to this day. Over time, that ambiguity created space for reinterpretation. As belief in internal, externally imposed punishment became less certain, especially under modernity, hell began to change. What most continue to interpret as something enforced from the outside, others began to interpret as something from within: guilt, despair, isolation, and the consequences of one's own actions. This shift wasn't just a modern invention from those looking for more definitive answers from Scripture, though. As early as the 4th century, Augustine of Hippo argued that sin was not merely an external transgression, but the disordering of the soul against itself, a condition that fractures the individual internally. And centuries later, Soren Kierkegaard pushed this idea even further, describing hell as a state of existential despair, being nailed to oneself, unable to escape one's own inner condition or align with the divine. In this view, hell isn't waiting at the end of life. It already exists here, shaped by memory and guilt of past deeds. Ultimately, Kierkegaard's description of despair maps remarkably close onto a town called Silent Hill. A quick editor's note, this section will get very spoilery towards the story of Silent Hill 2. So feel free to skip to this timestamp if you don't want to get it spoiled. You will miss out on a little bit of context for the conclusion of the video, but Silent Hill 2 is definitely a game you should experience yourself if you haven't already, and I would hate to ruin that for you. So proceed at your own risk, or go ahead and skip to this segment right here. Thanks. Specifically, in Silent Hill 2, James Sunderland is tormented and trapped by a world that is shaped by his own misgivings. James arrives in Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his wife Mary, who he knows to have died years earlier. The town, previously a spot that James and Mary loved to visit, is unrecognizable. Fog covers everything, and it is completely abandoned, save for a couple of faces. Grotesque, sexualized monsters roam the street and lurk in the shadows throughout. These monsters aren't your traditional demons from hell, but manifestations of James' eternalized and repressed sense of shame, guilt, and unresolved trauma. Pyramid Head, and arguably the most iconic figure in the franchise, does not stalk James due to his own evil nature, but he exists because, internally, James himself believes he deserves this punishment. This aspect in particular is where Silent Hill 2 falls in line with the theological shift I mentioned previously. Augustine's idea of sin being a soul at odds with itself echoes James and his fractured other self, represented through Pyramid Head. The torment doesn't come from divine judgment, but from the parts of himself he refuses to confront. Kierkegaard's concept of despair goes even further here. It's not something as simple as sadness or guilt, but the condition of being trapped within yourself, unable to reconcile with who you truly are. The town operates on the same logic, not allowing James to reach his conclusion until coming to grips with who he is and acknowledging what he's done.
My guilt has overwhelmed me, like a burden too heavy to bear.
And Silent Hill 2 doesn't even allow that redemption to be the standard. There are multiple endings based on how James acts and what he puts his focus into. James can wind up in a lot of conditions, such as accepting his past or continuing to ignore it. Silent Hill is not hell as a place, but the condition he brought upon himself. And in this way, it presents one of the most striking and interesting interpretations of hell imaginable. No fire and brimstone, there's a severe lack of demons with pitchforks, but a psychological and internal state brought upon oneself. And if hell can exist entirely within the self, then belief, or even God, is no longer required for it to feel real. Kierkegaard is often grouped together with other existentialists, but it's important to note that he was a Christian, and while his interpretation of hell may not have necessarily been an afterlife, it was rooted in faith. So what do others that do not share that faith do with the concept of hell? There are many examples, but to prevent this video from being too long, I'll focus on Jean-Paul Sartre. A famous writer and philosopher, Sartre is well known for saying that hell is other people, in his play No Exit. The concept of the piece is that, following their deaths, the individuals in the play are trapped in hell with each other for eternity. That hell, though, is simply a single building. Forced to be with one another for the remainder of their existence, which is forever, the idea of hell becomes less about torture and torment, and the focus shifts to the hell of one another, or at least the hell of someone else's perspective of ourselves. The most frightening idea of this is that our worst moments become our entire identity. I find that one of the most striking modern parallels to this is in Disco Elysium. Revachol isn't hell because of its violence or grotesquerie, but because the protagonist cannot escape how others perceive him. His past actions, his political beliefs, his addictions, his failures are constantly reflected back at him through conversation. Judgment happens socially, not divinely, through some higher power. Every interaction reinforces that same tension Sartre described. The self you believe you are versus the self the world sees.
For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light.
In this sense, Disco Elysium presents a different kind of hell. One focused on responsibility without absolution. Existence trapped under the gaze of others, where meaning must be constructed and where failure is impossible to fully escape. Sartre imagined hell as a room. Disco Elysium expands it into a city. What games like Disco Elysium, Silent Hill, Darkwood are doing might not be intentional adaptations of hell in any theological sense, but the framework still fits. And that's kind of the point. Every thinker and artist and developer in this video is working with the same raw material, whether they know it or not. Augustine, Kierkegaard, Sartre, and the authors of Revelation were all trying to give shape to something the text never fully resolved. The games inherited that unresolved tension, whether on purpose or not. And that ambiguity goes all the way down. Even within the Bible, hell isn't a single unified concept. It's an English translation that collapsed multiple ideas: Sheol, Gehenna, Hades, each with different meanings, different contexts, and different purposes. Those ideas evolved, contradicted each other, and got folded together into something that was never quite as clean as tradition would make it sound. What's funny is that video games have been doing the same thing this whole time. Sometimes hell is something you fight through, sometimes it's something you can't quite outrun, sometimes it's the way you think other people see you. Each of those versions inherited something real, either from Inferno or scripture or philosophy, and reshaped it into something that could actually be felt. And once again, that is what every version of hell in this video has in common. It's not fires or demons or punishment, but the attempt to give shape to perceived suffering that refuses to fit neatly into doctrine. If hell is just that, an idea that we keep returning to and rethinking, then maybe it was never an inevitable destination in the first place. It's the language we've reached for across centuries when we couldn't resolve something about what it meant to live badly, or to be judged, or to lose ourselves entirely. Maybe that just means it's not something to fear, but more so something to keep reimagining. That's already what we've been doing for centuries after all.